now that we are done with the torturing part, the modeling and the UVing and all that, we can jump right into the fun stuff and start painting the texture using 3D Code and Photoshop and my Intuos tablet, Intuos Pro, if you are wondering. Yep, we're already starting out, like exporting the texture into Photoshop with Ctrl P. As I mentioned in the first video, there are a bunch of concepts there. I will try and link the artists in the description because the way I painted this one was basically I had the references from Fernando Correa, but I wanted to paint the texture a little bit differently than he did. So I decided to collect some reference images that I found appealing, like their way of texturing, so I can use those as reference on how I will approach the surfaces of this character. Yep, I'm just filling in the first pass. Just most of the time when I'm texturing is filling each area with the proper color. Like the jumpsuit is blue and the leathers are all brown, and I use the paint area tool, which I showed you guys earlier in the previous video. Or maybe I didn't, but I will add it somehow if I didn't. Yeah, basically just want to have each area blocked out at this stage. I want to know what parts of the model are using what kind of material in this stage. It's basically just blocking it out here in 3D Code. And as you can see, I have the texture window open. That also helps like finding out where is what on the model. It's on the right side. But yeah, basically this is a very long video. I'm not sure if I will commentate the whole thing, but you know, I will do my best to talk a lot so you guys will be happy. So let's start with describing the forms first. I always try and start with the biggest shapes I see and get the right values and right forms first on the biggest forms or on the biggest piece of geometry I see. So here I started with the jumpsuit. I think it's a pretty large area to cover. As you can see, the symmetry tool is on. I use the symmetry thing that I showed in the first video, quickly adding some additional concepts to this thing. And yeah, I was not sure if I want to present this character from a top-down view or an orthographic view, because originally Fallout 2 was a top-down game, and I was thinking that maybe I will do a presentation shot from that view. So I decided to check the model frequently from that angle. So yeah, at this stage I always just think about form and describing the biggest shapes I see. So for example, the arm, I'm thinking of this arm or this piece of jumpsuit, the sleeves of it, as a big cylinder, and that cylinder is being lit from above. So that's why I painted the top side of this sleeve here a bit brighter than the bottom. And also, first I start out from mid-tones usually, and or maybe slightly darker than midtones most of the time, and start with the brighter values, adding brighter values to it. So as you can see, I filled the jumpsuit up with one solid color, which is pretty dark, I would say, and then started going over it with a brighter color on the shoulder area, as you can see, and here on the hair is exactly the same thing, just the biggest forms first. So of course the biggest form on the hair is the whole hair itself. So like the top side of the hair is brighter, and as we go a bit lower on the hair, it becomes a bit darker. So there is a slight gradient in that area. I could have baked an ambient occlusion, but that's not what I do. Most of the time I just jump right in and paint it with hand, because sometimes that ambient occlusion can give that CGI look pretty easily. I wanted to avoid that. So here it's just the biggest forms on the shape on the faces, like the eye sockets are darker generally. There is a dark patch for the shadow of the nose and the bottom side of the nose, and of course there is the shadow beneath the lower lip and cheekbones on the side of the face. And of course the neck area is a bit darker because it's inside this jumpsuit. So that's also in shadow, and it is receiving ambient occlusion. So that's why it's darker. Here I'm adding desaturated skin color to the areas of the like beard, where the beard would be. That's a good thing to add sometimes to the male face, and also some reddish tones to the nose and to the ear maybe, or the side of the cheekbones. That will give a bit more life to the character or the skin. I will change this face a lot, and the tones and the texture of it during the painting. But at the end of the video, I'm kinda stopping with the texture or the recording of the texture around like when the texture is 70% done maybe, and the recording is stopped at that point, and I will only do a comparison in the end, like compare where the video stopped and what the final results was or is. So I can walk you guys through on what I changed after the video was stopped, and we can discuss, or I will tell what I was thinking there and what was the difference and how I made it. But at this point it's not that important for us. Ow, I just hit my hand. Because right now I'm blocking in the secondary like big shapes, like the belt and the yellow color on the jumpsuit, which is also pretty big form, so we want to establish that as early as possible. Yep, adding some shadows to the hip area. We're just gonna call it hip area. Yep, and to the bottom of the arm and to the armpits. And it's the same thinking here. Basically, I'm thinking of the body as a cylindrical shape. So that's why if I imagine a light source coming from the front of the character, then the sides would be a bit darker. And also if I add another light source in my head to above the character, then it would result in a shadowy area beneath the arm and on the bottom side of the arm. So that's why I'm painting those areas a bit darker. Here I exploded the model so I can paint different areas separately above the character. So that's pretty useful sometimes to just separate some areas so you can look at them with a fresh eye and think of each piece of geometry and area as a separate maybe artwork or something. So you wanna push it to its limits and see what you can add to it to make it more interesting. And if it's separated from the main character and it's floating in outer space, then you don't have anything interesting around it, so you really just want to make it that more interesting if you focus on it. So, and also it's like, for me it's much more easier to paint sometimes like that, to separate some areas and just pay more attention to one of the parts. Like here I'm just doing exactly the same thing, imagining a light source coming from above, and that's why the top of the boot is more bright, and the shin area is a bit darker, because that area wouldn't receive that much lighting. So yep, that's something I always keep in mind, like my light source, and I mean it's an imaginary light source, of course, because I didn't make any maps for this one. As you can see, it's just starting with a blank gray thing and then just slowly working up the texture to its final form. So at this stage, like basically what I want to do is establish the biggest forms and make them interesting and readable from many different distances. So from far away, from close, or from middle range. I'm not really working that closely at this stage, only from far away and from mid-range, and giving forms that way. Here again, like making the bottom side a bit darker to give it more form, and then making the bottom side of the handle on the barrel a bit darker as well, and that will instantly make you think of it as a cylindrical shape. Like on the barrel it's more visible, like painting on top will make it turn in space a little bit. What I find, for me, what I find interesting or appealing in hand-painted game art is if the texture in itself has like a direct direction of light, but it also not too apparent, because the model will turn, or the character will turn upside down, or the pistol will be rotated, and we will see it from many different angles. So if the painted in lighting is too strong, then the weapon will look really weird if it's turned upside down. So my goal here is to paint a lighting here that it's like kind of believable from all angles and from all rotations, and it's pushed to its limits as much as I can, because for me what I find interesting is if the lighting is pretty intense, but at the same time it's kind of believable if I rotate the model around. Here it's the same thing, thinking of light source coming from above and making the Pip-Boy being lit from that direction, making the top side a bit more brighter. And what I usually do at this stage is not introducing new values, just painting the top side, and if I want to make something darker there, then I just erase back from the light that I painted there, so it will keep the values more coherent at that area, because I really just want to build up slowly to my final texture, and if I use like only one one additional value at this stage, then it's much easier to control and I will notice the mistakes more easily. So my goal here is just, keeping it as simple as possible for as long as I can, and just, trying to think of the whole thing as simply as I can, and slowly building up the complexity as I go. Let's see here. Made this the screen a bit more dark, so I can see, that I will have to add some detail there, like text or something later on. With the Pip-Boy that I'm painting right now, it is what it's called. It's a Pip-Boy. It's a Fallout 2 thing. But it did end up a bit monochrome in the end, so I introduced a lot of separate values, separate colors later, like pretty late in the project. Here I realized that I started with too solid of a color, so I added a hue saturation modifier in Photoshop and started painting in some random colors and random hue shifts on the model, because most of the time I don't start with a solid color. I start with like a painted base with some random hue shifts in it, and I decided to add this a bit later now because I forgot about it. So I just quickly jumped into Photoshop, duplicated the whole thing, added a few, color changes with the hue shift thing, and then collapsed the whole thing down and hit Ctrl save and jumped back here into 3D code. And we have some slight hue and color variation in the big blue jumpsuit. It's more interesting now. Painting a big ass number 13 on the back of the character, so everyone will understand that it's from Fallout 2, or it could be from Fallout 1 also. So let's take a sip of water so I can continue talking. Very good. I don't know what happened here, why it's so bright. Oh yeah, because I added a seam, or a seam, basically a cut on the jumpsuit, and I wanted to emphasize that edge a little bit by adding a highlight next to it. Painting the hip area, we will still call it hip area, from the back side. And as you can see, it's a very low contrast. What I found out like recently in the past 2 months or 1 month is that I cannot work on something that doesn't have good colors. So I made it a priority for me to establish a good solid color foundation for all of my work, because I cannot get excited about a project or about a painting or a texture if the colors are off. So I always fix the color issues now. If I see them, I just quickly go and fix them as soon as I can, because otherwise I will start to feel unmotivated barfing, and maybe not finish up the project. So just get the colors correct as soon as I can. I don't know why I said that, but I lost my train of thought. But probably during these 2 hours that will happen a lot, so I think I should get used to this, losing my train of thought. But here I painted the seam and added a bit of highlight next to it to emphasize it. Also, like at this stage I'm starting to think about the folding of the jumpsuit or the fabric there to give some variation to it and make it more interesting, because it would look pretty ugly if it was just one solid blue. So like applying some of the information on the concept, like the cool folding that's there, and also there is the cool line like shading on the tie. As you can see, there is these thin lines which are pretty cool. I will add those later. And here I decided to move the seam up a little bit, I think, or no, I painted the shoulder patch of the character, which then will turn out to be too small. By the way, I will have to make it more intense. And here, increasing the contrast of the texture, the whole texture, and collapsing it down, coming back to 3D code. It's a bit too saturated at the moment, but I don't think it's a problem. I will fix that anyway. And then now I wanted to have the tie area separate, so it has a unique UV space, and precisely for this reason to paint some ambient occlusion below it, because otherwise it would have been, you know, just I don't know, too separated from the character. So I really wanted to paint that ambient occlusion in there, because that's a really big piece of geometry there, and I wanted to have a shadow for it. So that's why I made the tie unique, and this is the reason that I think it's really important to think ahead when you're modeling and also when you're doing the UV, and think about what will look interesting if you start painting the texture. Of course, this is something that you cannot like learn like from the internet. It's something that only comes with practice, I think, and by figuring out what you like to do and how you like to work and what you find appealing to look at. So there are a lot of ways to make a texture look interesting, and there are like infinite amount of crazy good styles on an ArtStation, like 2D in a 2D world, like by concept artists and stuff like that. And basically all of those could be implemented in 3D with a different style and with a different thinking method of how you want to describe form and light and shadows and everything like that. And so there is no right or wrong here. There are, you know, just tools, and the way you use them is the key. And like discovering how you like to use these tools will end up being your style. So this is what I really encourage you guys to do, is approach what I say with an open mind and try and apply the things you like in my workflow, and try them out yourself and change them and modify them and add your own stuff that you like. And just because I start from like darker tones, that doesn't mean that you have to do it the same way, or that, you know, that's the right way to do it. It's just something that worked for me and that I like. But it's also a weird thing, because only when I'm painting textures, that's when I start out from dark tones. But when I'm painting an image, or, you know, just doing art in Photoshop, just painting a 2D image of a portrait or something, which you can check out on my Instagram, by the way, then I'm always starting out with the brightest color possible and then adding shadows right after. Because when I'm painting a 2D image, I just want to know what kind of bright colors will end up in the image, because I really like colors and I like to play around with them a lot, and I want my picture to be, or the image that I paint, to be driven by the final colors. And if I start out from dark and stuff like that, I'm not always sure how my bright tones will end up. So that's why I start out there with the brighter tones. But like here with texture painting, I'm usually starting out with the darker tones and work my way up the value ladder slowly. Here also adding the shadows and ambient occlusions there. Of course, if you want to, you can quickly generate an ambient occlusion map using 3D code. It's an easy thing to do, so if you want to, you can look it up how to do it. It's pretty easy, and that can, give you a solid base for the ambient occlusion and showing you where is what on the model. But I decided to start out from 0 here and just walk through the whole process from start to almost finish. So that's why when I look around on the model, sometimes I realize that there is a really bright area. As you can see here on the trigger, there is a metal thing that are supposed to be around the trigger, and that there is a really bright area right there which will be painted darker, so the whole thing is more coherent. I'm not sure I will use that word again because it feels weird to say it, and I know it's not right how I pronounce it, but I have no synonyms at the moment for it. But cohesive, that's right. So it will make the whole texture more cohesive, and by hiding those areas of connection between the separate geometries, if you can hide them properly, then your texture will look more painterly. So that's something good to keep in mind. Just hide the connection of geometries as much as you can. You don't want to have like those hard edges with the anti-aliasing, because that will break the illusion of the painting, so, or the texture. Like here, as you can see, I just paint it together with ambient occlusion, and it will be more cohesive that way, and more, harmonical. Also, it's like giving light to the top plane of that handle and pushing the values and shadows even more. And here, as you can see, there it is. I painted it together, and now it's more together. Yeah, obviously, but whatever. But I decided to add some light there. That way, it's more visible that there is another thing there, which is useful from the distance, I think. Makes it more readable. There are sometimes, I'm not sure about this, but I feel like it's a good idea to give like hot spots to areas of the texture. Like on this one, there is a hot spot at the end of the barrel, and I added a hot spot also on the handle at the bottom. Sorry, it's hard to speak this much, but I will try and keep it up. It's hard speaking. Anyway, so hotspots. Here I'm adding light coming from the top, because I realized that in the holster, if the gun is there, then the light would come from the top, and that will make it more interesting. So this is like something that the concept artist would never do or an illustrator would never do, because it's just not coherent lighting, because we have a light coming from the top lighting the barrel, and we have a light coming from the side lighting the handle. But you know, I think you can kind of get away with a lot if you balance the amount of light coming, or like the intensity of the light, and then just give as many light sources to one of the objects as you can, and then making it look interesting that way. So because the light is coming from the side on the handle, it will look correct if it's in the holster. So in the holster it looks correct now because the light is coming from the top, viewed from here. But if he grabs the pistol out from the holster and he holds it, then that area will be covered up by his hand, and as he holds the gun, the barrel is already lit from the top view, so it will look correct again, or as correct as I want it to be, or I can make it to be. So that's a trick or something that you can keep in mind and experiment with it. How many different areas or how many different light sources I can apply here and make the thing that much more interesting from all of those directions. Here just breaking up the big boring forms with some random lines, which doesn't make any sense, but it kinda looks interesting, for me at least. Because I don't really like to look at too big of a flat surface sometimes, or it's like balancing it out is something that I want to keep in mind. If it's too big of a surface without any interesting thing happening, I like to break it up a little bit and make some stuff happen there. And here, you know, just adding a shadow coming from the top and putting that what's that called, nail or bolt, that little metal thing on the side of the holster, sink in to the leather by giving them a little bit of bevel. That's a trick that I use a lot, like on like on the arms and on the seams of the arms, like giving a little bit of edge and a little bit of definition to it. So here, hip area again, and you know, just adding some of the details that were missing there. And after I figure out the big forms, usually I start moving on to giving edges and a bit more highlight to the character. Here I think I will end up deleting this one, but this is the direction that we will go into, most likely. But what you can see me do here is basically really quickly I put up the forms and paint up the forms of these areas, and imagine one light source. So for the leg here, I have a light source coming from the front and the back view, and slightly from the top. So, and I'm using that, and I'm doing that with a really big brush. I'm not really being lost in detail at that stage, and I'm just kinda, when I move on to the detailing phase, I just kinda embrace the chaotic brush marks that were, you know, left on the surface where I painted with the big brushes and started describing the forms. I really just want to pick and emphasize those chaotic brushstroke-like patterns and push them and make the area more interesting by just, you know, using up those quick brushstrokes that I put there. That's something that, you know, took me a while to figure out, that I don't really like thinking that much at the beginning of the painting. I just want to, you know, oh, this is the leg, the light's coming from this way, and then move away to the next area. It's like really quick, really just, you know, not too stressed. So it's like just putting it there and then, you know, something will happen to it. But that's something that was a bit problematic for me throughout the years, because that will ended up in a messy and chaotic texture. But later on I just decided to embrace it and use that chaotic base as a foundation for interesting shapes and interesting like ornaments and chaotic patterns on the surfaces of the textures and on the surface of the geometry. So that's why I usually just emphasize these kind of like foggy brushstrokey things a bit, and then, you know, using them as the foundation for my detailing. So that way I can keep the chaotic first pass that I like to do, and then, you know, just emphasize it a bit more, like here, just a few brush strokes on the dagger, not even really thinking about it that much, and then later on the knife I will detail these brush strokes a little bit more. Here's the same thing, just a few patches, and then going in, emphasizing some edges, like pushing them with a shadow below them. I know I jump a lot over different subjects, but I hope in the end it will make some sense for you guys, and that you can use these informations to your benefit. But yeah, it's the same thing with the texturing as with the editing. I don't like to prepare that much, so it's just improvisation here again with the commentary, and let's try the same. Let's hope the same thing will happen, just as in the textures, that I will, you know, flesh out some of the rough details that I hint during the talk and make it into something interesting. But you know, let's hope for the best. Here, the same thing, just using the big brush. Oh, and forgot to mention that during this making of I realized that I hit caps lock on the keyboard, then it will hide that yellow circle away around from the brush, and that's something that's really cool. I didn't know about it so far, but it's so good that when I paint, or when the brush touches the surface, then it's hiding away. Oh, here is an interesting or important thing, like emphasizing some of the connections, but like it hides the geometry where they connect a little bit, because it's painted together with this edge, and it will turn into a thicker ambient occlusion later on. So it's basically the opposite thing of, like, as you can see here, just emphasizing it a bit more, the ambient occlusion around those edges. So it's the same thing as like pulling or emphasizing edges, like I do here with the light. I can emphasize them. I do the same thing, but in a negative way, like emphasizing the connections a bit, or I mean the edges of the dark areas. That's something that sometimes I hide, sometimes I emphasize. It really depends on the area of the texture. What I was talking at the pistol, when I was painting the pistol, is sometimes when two geometries connect together, there is a like anti-aliasing weird thing that you really want to paint together, but it's okay to emphasize these connections with with painting like here, like the shadows, but that if you emphasize them here, then it will also hide the connection of the geometry at the same time. So that I know for a fact that this part didn't make any sense, but let's hope that it will in the end. So here, just doing the same thing, giving that area a bit more definition, and painting together how the two geometries connect quickly. And then I realized that you couldn't take off this Pip-Boy, so I added a cut here to make it possible to wear for somebody. So yeah, here the kind of working process starts to mix together a little bit, like emphasizing forms and now describing edges, both in the shadow areas and both in the light. So I will start and emphasize some of the edges and some of the like corners of the geometry with a lighter tone, and I already did it at some places on the Pip-Boy. But it's, you know, starting to mix together. Like here I realized that from far away it was not interesting enough, so I added some different color and other color variation to the ambient occlusion, so that way it's more interesting, like it has that rusty feeling because of the intense saturated brown added to the texture there. Also, what I found useful and interesting to look at is not sometimes to, when I emphasize an edge, I just make it a bit more chaotic than I would otherwise do, like not just pressing down the pen and emphasizing it all the way around with the same opacity. I'm just trying and make it more chaotic by varying the pen pressure a little bit, how I push it down, and that way the edge will become at some areas more pronounced and more interesting, and at some other places. So that's like basically really a small thing when just touching the tablet with the pen. It's like happening in a smaller scale, like thinking about how if I rhythmically push the pen against the tablet, how it will look on the texture. So not like holding it down and pressing it down really hard all the way and just you know, painting everything with the same opacity, but like, ooh, what the fuck was that? Anyway, so like making a little bit of a dot-like movement when I'm painting results in a completely different end result, and I like the end result better that way, and also the working method is much better that way also. So that's a fun thing to keep in mind, experimenting on how you use your pen and how you push it down onto the tablet. It's a pretty small thing, but it could give you different end results, so, or interesting end results. Here, just giving some form to the eyeballs and trying emphasizing them a little bit, pushing the forms of the face into a more interesting direction. The face will change a lot, as I mentioned earlier, but you know, at the end of the video I will make a comparison between the final version and the version that's at the end of the video. The reason I didn't record the process all the way is because it always becomes too experimental in the end, and maybe I work for 7 hours and then I don't like the end result and I just, you know, delete it or do another version. But that rarely happens, like 7 hours. But in a small scale, like I paint for half an hour or an hour on the face, and then I'm like, oh, this is a completely wrong direction, and I delete it. So it would have been really tricky to record it, and it would have taken a lot of time to watch it. So I decided to record a part of the process that's quick and, you know, dynamic, and after just walk through what I did after that. So here also another pass on the ear and on the face, like emphasizing some forms and some deep shadows and the structure or anatomical structure of the ear. Of course it's all fake, because it's not a photorealistic ear or anything like that. It's just a stylized ear, so you can get away with a lot of incorrect things or suggested things there. Here I think we will slowly move on to pushing the shapes a bit more and adding another level of value to the whole thing, because as you can see, it was before the whole thing was pretty flat, in a sense that it used the same value all over the model, or very similar values all over the model, and the contrast was pretty low. So it was time to push these folds and forms a bit more, and that's what I like to do basically, is keeping everything, you know, very low contrast and working my way up. And as I mentioned here, I just quickly emphasize some of the chaotic brush strokes that I made in the first pass, give them some dimensions and push the values a little bit, and describe some of those brush strokes as like they have edges to them or shadows to them. Yeah, and I realized that on the leg, the bag for the knife is like mirrored, so the less detailed side of the dagger is on the outside. So I will flip it in 3ds Max later on. Here just adding some random details again to make it more interesting. And as you can see, I'm not painting a straight line. This is what I was mumbling about a few minutes ago. It's not a straight line, it's a bit shaky, it's a little bit wavy, it's more interesting that way for me. And it's also easier to paint because I naturally kind of paint like that, a bit chaotic, a bit uncontrolled. So yep, here quick highlights, and as you can see, as I mentioned, not pushing the edge all the way around, just suggesting some part of it and at some places, and then that's it. Not really mess around too much with that. Here, like a first pass on the highlights or the brightest values on the dagger, because once I'm finished with the blocking out phase and first pass for the forms, I usually start and detail it up on a middle scale and think about how it will look like this close, and emphasize some forms that way. What I kind of start to feel like is when I'm painting textures or paintings, that it's pretty like fractal-like. So the same way I think about the big forms and the big shapes, and the same way I paint those, will be applied to the middle level of detail. So I'm basically thinking the same things here, just on a different scale. Like, okay, I have now smaller forms, like the fingers, and in between the fingers, I just want to emphasize those forms, just as I did with the jumpsuit. So basically it's the same thing, just on a different scale. So it's pretty for me it's a pretty good thing, because I just like to paint this way, not too controlled, a bit chaotic, and I'm just trying to emphasize that sometimes, and on some areas, like here, adding some more mid-level detail on the sleeves, and then jumping back to the weapon and giving those brighter highlights and pushing the forms a bit. As you can see, I decided to add some deep shadows, because if you look at the whole pistol, all the shadows are are much the same value, and I wanted to go over the whole thing with a bit more darker tone and a darker value for the deepest shadows that I have here. As you can see, the edge emphasizing thing that I was talking about on the side, just quick dots and broken up lines to emphasize some of the forms on the pistol. Zooming out a little bit and pushing the gradient of the whole thing a bit more on the pistol, and also describing the form of the handle and giving those light as well, to make it read much better from further away. Yep, painting together the geometry, as I mentioned earlier. Yep. So I use gradients a lot. I think those are pretty useful. From the tip of the gun towards the handle, as you can see, we have a gradient there, and that will give it more interesting shapes to look at, because like there will be a more contrasty area between the handle and the base of the pistol, and that area will be more interesting as well, by giving it a bit of gradient. Here, adding the front side of the front yellow line to the jumpsuit, sipping some water, and then just quickly adding the folding that I already had there, and emphasizing that a bit more. Yep, just gonna adjust my microphone quickly. Yep, also it's a good idea to save incrementally so you don't damage your files. I would suggest you do that, but 3D Code is pretty reliable in that sense. I never had a 3D Code file that became damaged because of saving, or like crashing or something. So cheers for that. It's a good software, by the way. I recommend it a lot. Yep. So as you can see, there are some more intense lights and more intense form description all over the model. Like on the number 13, I just did a quick pass before. and then coming back and softening some of those more intense colors a bit up. So yeah, basically what I try to do with the texture is try and make it look interesting. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And during some of these like textures I painted, I discovered a bunch of things that I find good looking. Like accidentally I sometimes make some mistakes and I like the end result, and then I will implement that mistake to my workflow. So it's for me it's really important to like pay attention to these mistakes, like the caps lock thing that I mentioned earlier. It was turned on, the caps lock, and I was like, oh, here, quickly adding a gradient to the whole character in edit projection, external editor, and doing a gradient, and here fixing up the dots that projection produced by jumping into Photoshop, creating a new layer, fill it with one solid color, and coming back here and collapsing them together, the gradient and the solid color layer, and setting it to multiply, and then just adjusting the opacity of it. As you can see, you can use multiply and other blending options in 3D Code as well. Just change the opacity to 30%. Then here I make a new layer and set it to color dodge, and use white to go over the model and give more interesting color and light dynamics to areas. So here we have the fake lighting coming from the top for the flask, for the weapon, pushing it a bit more, and some of the hot spots on the textures got some love with this pass. So for me, after a while, I'm like getting a bit bored with the texture sometimes. I'm like, okay, this is time to push some of the shapes and forms a bit more, and I go over the whole thing with a color dodge and some multiply sometimes, and push and emphasize some of the forms that I kind of know that I will use, and then just, you know, making them a bit more visible and a bit more interesting and more fresh that way. So there is also another video in my on the YouTube channel that is called Projection Basics or something like that. I will link it here. That basically details how I use projection, because it was pretty quick here when I made the gradient from top to bottom for the character. It was pretty quick. So you can check that out and see how I fixed the bugs that it produces. So anyway, here, like not emphasizing the whole edge, just some parts of it. And also you can add reflections like I do here. The form is turning because of the dark I added, but around the edge where the form goes, where the form is like on the edge, yeah, I just add a layer of highlight again, like here. As you can see, I add a layer of light, and from the side view it will kind of look like a reflection. I know it doesn't look, or maybe, yeah, it does, because I'm looking at it in a thumbnail thing, so it's not visible at the moment, but on the final one it looks kind of like that. And I like to add reflection to metal because it makes it a lot more interesting. So yeah, like there are some color variations here. This, as you can see, I added some shadows below the edges to emphasize them a bit more. I do that a lot, I think, around the model. Or I mean, I will do it a lot in the future. And here from the top view, adding some highlights and reflections also to make it more interesting. So yeah, I think I will do some other pass on the dagger later on. Here I realized that the inside is not painted. Also wanted to add some cuts and more interesting detail onto the leather area there. Also I realized that I missed it out from the color dodge session earlier, so I gave it some more form. As you can see, picking the big brush, giving some emphasizing thing on the edges. And here let's detail up the flask, and my screen went totally black for a moment again, but we are back. So giving some light to the top area, because I decided to put light source above. Here just giving some ambient occlusion and some form definition to the whole thing, emphasizing where the metal is connecting with the blue area, the body of this flask, giving those highlights into the shadow parts and making them a bit more interesting. And here I kinda chip away from the highlight with a negative or a darker brush to make it more interesting, like the value patch of the form describing brushstrokes were too monochrome, and there were no interesting shapes there, so I used the same like a darker color and broke it up a little bit. Here also adding some little bit of highlights and a little bit of interesting details, but not to every place, but to the light areas, or that the areas that are in the light can be detailed like that, and it will automatically suggest that all of the other parts of the texture are similarly detailed, while in reality they are not that detailed. But like giving hotspots to these objects and to the parts of the area or parts of the texture is also useful because of this, because you can detail those areas up a little bit more, and you don't have to detail the other parts that much, because your brain will automatically fill in the details there. Adding some rust and some interesting details there to see how they work. But yeah, everything is up for experimentation, so it's just a style of rendering that I do. If you want to experiment with more clean looking textures, you should definitely do that. But these are some of the stuff that worked for me. But I cannot emphasize this enough, to keep in mind that everyone has their own workflow, everyone has their own likes, so just try and discover what they are for you, and make a living out of those. Also I added some like reflections here on the bottom side of the barrel, just right now, or just a moment ago, which is reflecting the brown from the handles. That's also, I think, looks cool on metal, to give those reflections of color from around the surrounding parts of the texture. Yep, breaking up the values, I mean the shapes of the values, and giving it a bit more chaotic look. So from further away it looks more broken up, more damaged, because I really didn't want to make it look too clean. And yep, I think I forgot to say in the first video how to turn wireframe on, but it's in the view menu. You can check, there is a wireframe thing, and you can hit it and it will show the wireframe. I have it on F4 for a shortcut. So yeah, as you can see from further away, I added some dots and brushstrokes. Right now it looks really like spotty and like too chaotic from middle and close range, but I will hide it a little bit better later on. It's just a first pass on trying and making the weapon look more interesting from further away, because it was too, clean for me. Also, one thing I would like to mention is, or I already said it, but I didn't record the detailing part of this one, but there will be another video that is similarly 2 hours long or something like that, and that will be the texturing of the car, and there will be I will leave a link in the description that will point you to that video, and in that video there will be a part where I start detailing some of these areas up, but those detailing will happen on the car, so you can see how I detail, but not with the character, because I didn't record it with this one. But yeah, in the other video you can check it, how I go about detailing it, and that can be interesting or useful also. And yep, similarly, not emphasizing the whole edge on the top side of the handle, just parts of it, and that will make it a bit more interesting to look at. And also I don't want to make the texture too busy, because if everything is emphasized, then nothing is emphasized. So leave some areas chaotic and blurry or in shadow, and detail some areas up a bit. That's what worked for me so far, and this is basically how I like to work. Here I think I will try and add a bit of desaturation to the leather. I found that pretty when I paint leather, to add some desaturated areas that will give it more life, I feel like. But yeah, the same issue was with the holster as well as on the pistol. It was too how to say it, too clean from farther away. And here, as you can see, just as I mentioned, pushing some of those random shapes and giving those brush strokes a bit more life. Let's adjust my seating position quickly. Yes, much better. Yep, and there it is, those desaturated marks. It would maybe help if I watched this video in a full resolution and I didn't need to guess what's happening on the screen. But, next time I will be more prepared. Here, still touching up some areas on the weapon, making it more interesting. One interesting concept or experimental concept for me at this moment is I had this weird thing happen to me when I was working at one of my old workplaces, and one of my friends there were like showing me one of the works that somebody did on the internet, and we were checking it out, how awesome it looked. And I asked him I asked him, what do you think he was thinking about when he was painting the texture of this thing? What was he thinking about? And he goes, I think, yeah, I think he was thinking about the texture when he was making it. And I was like, at that moment, like, that's a pretty good idea. Like being mindful and focusing on what you're doing. I know it's like pretty common sense, but for me at that time it was like a revelation that sometimes my mind can be pretty scattered, even though like I'm doing something that's interesting to me. I'm like painting this edge here, painting this Pip-Boy here, but at the same time I'm thinking about like, oh, I should have played League of Legends instead of Overwatch, or I should have paid my bills already, or I should have studied for this exam, or should have learned this, and I should write a message to this and that and call up my mom or something. So there's a lot of things to think about, but for me it's became more and more in focus that I should be more mindful when painting textures or modeling or everything like work related. So I think it was worth mentioning here, even though it doesn't make too much sense. But yeah, just trying to have a calm and empty mind and focused mind during painting will always result in like a more pleasurable painting process and a much more better end result. So for me it's now a pretty important thing to practice to become more mindful during painting. So yep, still continuing with this thing, the Pip-Boy. I think the hardest thing with this project was maybe, well, there were no hardest things, I believe. Maybe the hair, I struggled with the hair a bit, and it's still not finished at the moment, but I will finish it tomorrow. But yeah, I don't like to paint hair that much. I don't know what to do about it. Maybe I will discover a secret method on how to start liking the stuff that you don't like painting, but I not discovered one so far. So the hair was an area that I didn't like to paint that much, but just push through it. Here also emphasizing those forms that we talked about. Here just making it more random, as you can see, and more chaotic from the middle distance. And then later on I will go in and emphasize those areas a bit more in the later stages of the painting. So yeah, basically this is what I think about most of the time. Like now, giving those dot-like edge descriptions that will result in a more interesting like shape description and more interesting texture to look at. Like if you just do one line for the edge and that's it with one opacity, that will look pretty shitty in my opinion. but if it's broken up, it's a bit more detailed, it's thick and thin, it fades away, then it comes back, and then it has a big patch of scratch in it and stuff like that. That will be more interesting, and it's suits the style of this project a bit more. It's also a good idea to keep in mind the overall theme. Like, this is a post-apocalyptic character, so it wouldn't make too much sense if he had a polished up, beautifully painted like device on his arm that has 0 damage on it or anything like that. It's just more in line with the theme, with the post-apocalyptic, like rusty, like junky feel of it. So yeah, also here kind of move away from the concept a little bit with the Pip-Boy, both with the color and with the shapes. I don't know why I did that, but probably because from this angle there weren't too many details that were on the Pip-Boy, so I decided to use another kind of reference for it, as you can see in the modeling part of this video. And yeah, just keeping in mind what kind of detail I can put in there, like here with the scrolling cylinder I added some cuts on the side, so that way it's more interesting to look at, and also makes more sense from the usage point of view. So a little bit of highlight on the screen here, which I will I will end up deleting, because it didn't make any sense to put a highlight right below that area, because that's supposed to be in shadow. So I think by the end of the texturing I will reverse that area, and the bottom of the screen will be lit up and the top will be in shadow. But yep, as you can see, giving more random big brush strokes to the highlights and making it more interesting that way. Like those little dots and little patches of brush strokes will really help emphasizing some of the surface and texture of that area and that particular part of the model. Yep, like here, giving some ambient occlusion that was missing from that area, and it's still not enough, but it was just a first pass. But yeah, it's something that it's pretty important, and it's kind of hard, but trying and keeping in mind the whole process and different parts of the process at the same time can be really beneficial. Like, looking at this Pip-Boy and thinking how the highlights are working, how the edge definition is working, and how the ambient occlusion is working is crucial. So as I progress throughout the texture, there are more and more things to keep in mind, because in the beginning as I mentioned, I try to keep everything as simple as possible for as long as I can, precisely for that reason, because I can control the one or two things at the beginning much better. Because if I just focus on making everything look good from the point of view of shapes and ambient occlusion, then I can go over all the whole model and figure out what area should have what kind of ambient occlusion and what kind of form or light, and then after I'm sure that every area has its correct AO and form, I can move on to adding edges and dark edges and deep shadows and highlights. But if I just jump in and put everything, every part of the process on to the model at the same time, then then the end result will be pretty chaotic. So that's what I try to add, one thing at a time, and keep it simple for as long as I can. And then when I'm like painting throughout the whole thing and visit some of the areas that I think I finished, I just think through that, okay, how is ambient occlusion working on this area? Quickly go through the whole area and see how AO is working, and then, okay, let's see how the light is working from far away, close range, and from really closely, and then fix those up, and then move on to the edges, highlights, deep shadows, and deep edges, and then go through that area from the point of view of that part of the process, and then maybe finally just surface details and how they are working. And after that I can be sure that I did everything I wanted to, and at that part of the model. So because sometimes I miss like ambient occlusion, and I said it again, very weird. So at some part of the model, like here on the neck, the jumpsuit is not painted together correctly. So at one point in the video or in the future, I realized that the neck and the jumpsuit are not connected properly, and the ambient occlusion is too not strong enough in that area, and I will emphasize it more. But it's just something to keep in mind, like all the time, to check previous parts of the workflow and see how they work on the part that you're painting at the moment. Here I decided to add the eyes, and one thing to keep in mind here is the face changed a lot, the hair changed a lot during the making. This is not even the final model, because when I'm starting to paint the face or the texture or everything, basically there is a lot of issues that only come out when you start painting. So for me it's really important to keep in mind the previous parts of the process here, and see what I can fix from model, and see what's not working on the model, because sometimes if I look at the texture and I'm like, it's not working, something's not okay with the face, then I step back, take a look at how the model is working beneath, and I realize that the texture is bad because the model is kind of shaped weirdly at that part, and I just quickly jump back to 3ds Max, fix the geometry up, and replace it in 3D code quickly. And then sometimes the source of the problem was precisely coming from the model, but that's something to keep in mind, or sometimes just take a look at the model and step back a little bit, and think through what kind of detailing you can put onto the model that would support the texture. So I believe when I finish the whole thing, finish the texture, I went over the whole model and emphasized some of the folding on the arms. So yeah, like different parts of the process is really just blend together as I progress. Like the texturing, UVing, modeling, and everything just becomes like a very intuitive and reflex-like thing by the end. There is no like limit or lines there anymore, so it's just something. I look at the model from all the different aspects I can think of, like, oh, how the model is working here, how are the edges, how is the AO, and then move on to another part and then look at that, like, oh, do I have any deep shadows, and then just trust my eye at that point, because I just get used to the project by that time, and I'm getting used to the areas that I feel like are working the best, and I'm trying to figure out why those areas are working and apply those things to the whole model and the whole thing. So that is, I really like that part of the painting or the projects always, when all of these things come together in a big tornado and everything starts becoming more and more better and more cohesive and more together, and it's just really intuitive and it's fun. And of course sometimes there is like, I zoom onto the area and I feel that, oh, it's shit. I don't know why it is, but I kinda learn to trust that. If I look at an area and I feel like something's off here, or something's not working, then I just redo it, try again and again and again, and why is it not working? Think through all the processes, like, is the model okay? Is the form description okay? Are the colors working correctly? Is there enough color variation? Is the AO okay? Are there any deep shadows? Is the lighting of the edges okay? Are the gradients working? Is the anatomy correct? Is the surface detail too much, or everything? Just go through it, and usually the issue will be like in one of these principles or areas that I just listed, and then, oh, okay, it's because of that, quickly fix it, and when I'm looking at that part of the model again, I don't feel that it's shit anymore, so I move on to another part. So this is something that always happens at the end of the project, and I really encourage you guys to push your projects into that area, and try, and when you are feeling like, oh, this is done, let's post this, sleep on it one more day and push everything a bit more, think through, experiment a little bit, because in that last 10 or 15% of the project, I think you will learn a lot, or at least for me, that's how it worked. I know that there are a lot of artists that live by the code of quantity out there, and that could work also, but for me it's much more interesting and more intuitive to work like this, to see that in the end what kind of new detail or new brush stroke or new mark or a new way of texturing I can experiment on the model, and also with the presentation, like experiment and try new things. Maybe they will never go onto the internet, but by experimenting and messing around with them, you might discover some stuff that will be useful later on the later projects. So here also, like, just applying the reference image that I found, and look at the highlights and forms and shadows there and try and apply them to my texture as well. The face, as I mentioned, changes a lot, but here I knew that something was really off at this point, but I couldn't really figure out what it was. Turns out that the forehead was kinda small also, and it was shaped weirdly, so it was fixed later on. But yep, like finding real life references is also a good thing, I think. It can be useful, especially for anatomy, to see what kind of forms you can emphasize, and also I would suggest like drawing. Picking up drawing and digital painting will help a lot. If you want to paint textures better, it's a good idea to practice painting from the imagination and drawing from the imagination, like sometimes at least, because that will really help to pinpoint exactly the holes in your game. So if you cannot paint a face from your imagination, or you cannot draw it, then you will know that, oh, I don't know how jaws are working, or I don't know how the cheekbones are located, because each time I'm drawing a face from imagination, I don't know where to put the jawline. Then the next time you sit down and do a study, then you can learn how to paint the jaws, and then next time you sit down and paint from the imagination, you will get it better. And it will really help with doing character art, having some good foundation of anatomy. I would say it helps, but I could also say it's essential. So I think it's something that's worth practicing. Anatomy, drawing studies, and stuff like that. But you know, it can also done in a fun way, so you don't have to like sit down and make it miserable. Just also you can experiment with how you learn these things. So for me it was just grabbing a notebook and getting onto the tram in the city, and when I went to work I just started sketching into that like notebook on the tram. It was really scary for me because I didn't want to like paint or draw in front of people or in the crowd, because the tram can get pretty crowded, and I was just like sketching there and drawing some really ugly heads, because you know at that time I didn't know too much about anatomy or heads or anything, so the drawings were like pretty shit, and I also knew that they were pretty shit, so that didn't really help. But I was like, I don't want to waste my time going into work and not doing anything. So I figured I could play chess on my phone, or I can paint or draw into a notebook. And I started drawing these heads, and after figuring out how to not pass out from the stress, I started drawing these faces better and better each time. And you know, after a month or two, I realized the progress and how much I came from the first head, and I started falling in love with painting or drawing sketches from the imagination, because it just became a fun process for me. So just things like that, experiment and find your own way. But whoops, yep, pushing it a bit more, the shadows beneath the arms, to make it more contrasty. And also you could have, you saw not too long ago that I emphasized the edges a bit more on the seams of the clothing, both in the deep shadows and both in the highlights, just putting some deeper shadows and deeper cuts into the seams there, adding some folding to the back, and making it more like interesting. Folding is pretty tricky when hand painting, because you have to kind of paint like a fake folding that could potentially work if the arms are, you know, folded or straightened out. It cannot, the folding cannot be too specific, so it's like a a middle folding that is kind of believable from more poses as well, not just from one perfect pose. So it's a fine line of not putting too much or not enough folding there, or putting too much folding. So let's just experiment and see what looks good. And also, if the character is rigged and there is another pose, then, you know, all of that beautifully painted folding can fall apart, because if the character hunches forward and grabs the pistol, then one area can start to fall apart and look weird, that why is this knee is folding this way and why are the folds on the clothing looks that way when the arms are bent. So just try and check how it looks animated, or rig it yourself and check it how it will look, and try and discover a natural folding rhythm for the clothing. I know it's not an easy thing to do. For me, it's also not easy to paint folds, but I kinda fake myself through it sometimes. So that's the secret right there. Yep, making it more brighter on the top side, the color, and then emphasizing the cut right next to that yellow thing. Yep, this area was totally not touched at all, so I decided to go over it once or twice and giving it more definition. Yep, it's also important to zoom in and out from the model and check your texture from far away, closer and really closely, because most of the time the task is something like, okay, in game art they will be like, oh yes, of course it should look totally awesome from really far away, but it should look even more awesome when you get closer. But when you look really closely, it should look the most amazing ever on the planet. So these are the requirements, like 99% of the time. So it's just better to keep that requirement in mind when painting. And it's kind of an impossible request, but you know, you can get closer to it each time if you try. But of course, if we wanted to make this character look really good from top down. We could do a lot of things to it that would just totally not work if we get closer. So that's why I think it's kind of an impossible request, because there is just so many things that we could apply it from the bird's eye view, apply to it from the bird's eye view, that would fall apart. That you just make it look as good as it can from far away, and then try and not do anything that will interfere with the other levels of detail, and just try and make them work together and see how they work that way. So it's really important, zooming in and out. Yep, just touching up the hair a little bit, giving it a bit more form. Oh yeah, the hair like completely changed, or I mean it changed a lot, the model of it. This I don't know, this front part of the hair became much less pronounced and a bit more flat. But yeah, here just adding some cuts and separation to the hairstyle. I will end up deleting the one on the left. So if we look the character from the front, the separation from the left side will disappear. I will fix that, or yep, later on it will be deleted. Here, not sure what's going to happen now, but as again, if I look at this Pip-Boy now, I feel it's a bit low contrast. There are not enough deep shadows here, so it would, definitely benefit from a pass of deep shadows, because that's a bit too monochrome, I think, value wise. I'm not sure if I will do it here, but on the end result I will definitely push those values a bit more. And also this is something that I would encourage you guys to do, to watch these videos, and this one, and also the other one where I time-lapse the car, to watch those with an active mind, and try and see what will you do differently, or guess what I will do next, or think about why I did certain brush strokes, or why I emphasize certain forms, and try and grab what you like and apply what you found useful, instead of just passively looking and accepting that this is the way to do it. So yeah, definitely just keep it experimental and open-minded. Yep, just gonna detail up the Pip-Boy a bit more, and I really hope that I will add some deep shadows here, so you guys can see what I was talking about a bit earlier. But maybe I am cruel and I will not do it here. But yeah, like this one, I think it's pretty, the highlights are working, it's pretty well defined, but it doesn't really work in the shadows. The shadows are really undefined, especially if you see it from the front, where you can see the deep shadow of the, like here, as you can see the deep shadow of that area, that really just pronounces it even more, that there is a whole range of values missing from the deep parts of this Pip-Boy. So not sure if I will go over it here. But yep, realized that this is too monochrome, it was bothering me for a while. So I added some patches of rust to it. And also doing a color dodge layer with it, but I think it's more too intense. Definitely tone it back. Yeah, sometimes I do it like this. I go over the top and then tone back what I did a little bit. So that's how I usually try and find the sweet spot for big modification changes like this in the texture. Not sure what's going to happen. Oh, I think I will desaturate it a bit. I will desaturate it a bit and change the hue. Yep, he started to look a little bit tanned or a little bit sunburnt, so I fixed that quickly. Not sure what will happen next. Oh, yeah. So cute. Very handsome. This is one thing that, oh, there we go. As I mentioned, I realized the missing AO from the neck and then just quickly fixed it, but I will go over it a bit more later. So as I starting to say that he's kinda looks like a pretty boy here, but in the end he kinda turns it into that scar-faced, rusty adventurer. I will show you guys at the end of the video, because that's more in line with the theme, like giving him a bit more history on the face, more wrinkles and less saturated, more serious. He's pretty happy here, or yeah, not that wasteland like. He would look really off from a Mad Max movie. I would say from the new Mad Max movie. Definitely don't sit him next to Tom Hardy, because Tom Hardy would take his lunch money very quickly. So decided to make the face a bit more angular and emphasize some of the shapes a bit more, like as you can see on the cheekbone, there is a hard cut there. Sometimes I start and apply a rendering method and apply it throughout the whole character, and go through with it. Like there will be this sketchy feel for the jumpsuit all over later on, and I will apply it to the whole thing, to the car and everything. There's like when you're using a pencil and you're giving values and forms to like a sphere or something, there will appear some of these lines, and I decided to add those, and it's also on the concept which I mentioned earlier, those like lines on the thigh area, and I really like those, and I wanted to apply that detail all over the model. Here trying to push and increase the highlights a bit more, but this area has the same issue, I believe, like the Pip-Boy. On the upper lid, as you can see, it's one value, the whole thing is one value. It's missing some deep shadows and definition of that area and some anatomy on the upper lips. Definitely need to detail those up a bit more. like especially if you compare it to the inside of the ear, how dark it is. We could add those dark tones to the corner of the mouth also later on. Yep, as I mentioned, making it more angular, giving those cuts and cuts on the jawline as well. Not sure what will happen here. Maybe fixing some of the forms on the face. Yep, some additional edges, emphasizing some of it, so it looks more interesting from far away. And I'm gonna start and detail up the hand a bit more. Give some highlights to emphasize the anatomy. And here, yeah, I would say it's really beneficial to do some studies and, you know, just learn how a hand looks. I'm not saying mine is perfect, but it's definitely better than I did 5 years ago. So there is always room to improve. And I think I will pull a reference here for the top side of the hand soon. But yeah, overall, these are the things that I think about during texturing. And what I also mentioned during the video is that there are a bunch of things that are very beneficial for texture painting, which are not directly related to like texture painting. So painting or illustration in Photoshop, also drawing studies from real life, and even scenes, not just like characters. And drawing from the imagination also helps a lot, and everything like that will just bleed over to your hand painting and texturing skills, and also to modeling, because, you know, sometimes you just get like fed up with modeling or 3D. You're like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. But then you can still grab a piece of paper and start drawing a little bit, relax that way, find some good art exercises. There are a lot that you can try. Google them, like art exercises or something, and just experiment with them, and you will find one of them relaxing and fun to do, and it will be pretty beneficial for your 3D world. That's something I think it's really important, and it helps a lot. It makes your life much easier in the long run, especially in the long run. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's a good idea to hide everything and focus a bit more. But maybe I'm not doing it for this reason here, just giving it a bit more gradient and more interesting look from far away by giving those a bit more value change towards the fingers. And here again, adding a color layer and make it really intense first, and then later I will tone it back a little bit. It's just a coloring layer, and then I will tone it back. Like the opacity of the whole layer will be toned back to like 10 or 3 or whatever. and it's a really subtle change, but it helps a little bit with the hand, I feel like. Adding some wrinkles, because why not? But yeah, the whole hand will change a bit. Some things on the model and a few things on the texture. So always keeping an eye out for these changes. Giving some different, highlights for the fingernails, making them separate material a little bit by giving them a bit of highlight. And I think I will change the color also. Yep. Just fixing up some anatomical things a bit more, but soon I will bring in a reference image, and that will help a lot, because as you can see, sorry, it's pretty late. As you can see, this is what I was talking about. This hand I'm painting from the imagination here, as you can see, no reference or anything. And the top side of the hand is basically empty. This is an area that my mind has no info on, or it was lazy to come up with. So that top area is like, you can see the knuckles are kind of defined, and the fingertips, and the bottom side, and the thumb. It all has definition and form, and the first pass, but there is just like an empty space at the top of the hand where my imagination and knowledge has like no info to look for. So here I load the reference image quickly and use it to push the shapes and texture of the hand a little bit. But in the end it will change also a lot. But as you can see, adding some veins in there and pushing some of the forms, it already becomes more interesting and filled with more life. But this could definitely benefit some dirt also, and like a little bit of texture detail, like using the brush, like the big brush, and giving it some dirt and some variability in the surface, and emphasizing those. Like when I detailed up the pistol, I could apply the same thing here with the hand, because as you can see, there's just too smooth and too together, or I mean too flat. So yeah, that's definitely some things that you can think about when watching this video or the next one, because we are getting close to the end of this video. I would definitely recommend you watching the next one with the car, and approach it with that critical mindset. Also, I will probably include in the gumroad thing the model with the UVs, so you guys can just start painting it if you want to, and I will include the texture and this one that we're about to like finish here. I will include this one and the one that's the final, so you guys can locally change it on and off, and maybe even include more stages of the texture with the gumroad thing. But it's going to be a pay what you want thing, so basically the limit for that is 25 megabytes on Gumroad, so I will keep and keep the thing below that. So you can donate any amount you want, even zero. So basically you can download everything for free from Gumroad. The link will be in the description. Yep. But the videos are on YouTube. The only things you will be able to download are the model, brush stroke or brushes I used, and the textures, both for the car and both for this character, the chosen one, as they call it. And yep, I will definitely try and credit the artists whose references I used here. They are very, very good. All of them can be found on ArtStation. And yeah, as you can see here quickly, just giving more life to the foldings as a goodbye to the viewers. That's you, by the way. So, yep. It flew right by these 2 hours. I almost didn't notice it. So, yep, definitely make sure to check the final one, because it changes a lot. But we will make a video right when this one ends, where I will, talk about what's the difference between this texture you see here and the one that's going to be on ArtStation. Yep. Not sure if anything interesting will happen in the last 10 seconds, but you can stick around and find out. And otherwise, see you guys in a second. So before ending the video, the texturing video, let's walk through the process GIF and talk a bit how it was made and go over some of the stuff we already talked about. So this is the first step. Each time, like blocking out areas of colors and areas of material. Not all of them are blocked out here, but it's just the first pass. Also on the car, I already added first pass shadow. As you can see below the hood here, it's in shadow. It's much more, it's darker than the top side, so that way you can already understand that it's not facing upwards. So this is like giving form to the hood and the front of the car, and also to the bumper. Just the first pass. Here, blocking in the first colors at each material, like on the jumpsuit. I started giving just the shadow here on the inside of the leg and light coming from the shoulder and on the arm. I basically went over the whole thing with one value for the jumpsuit from top to bottom, giving some form to the character and to the shapes, like basically imagining that there is a light source coming from the top. And also this is the same thing I did for the items here. Like I imagine the light coming from the top. There is the flask here coming from the top and a bit towards the camera, so not completely from the top, but from the side a little bit also, and giving some form and lighting accordingly. So the blue part here is bright, but it fades off as it goes below here, and there is like a vignette effect here which I think kind of looks cool. Also here on the bumper I added a first pass for the shadow, or for the planes that are facing downwards on the bottom side of the bumper. And also on the wheel you can see the first pass of the dark areas, like here. Didn't really do much with the face, just giving some texture and color variation here, like desaturation of the beard area and some slight shadows beneath the nose and eye sockets. Yeah, but basically this is the very first rough part, just a big brush going over everything and imagining the brightest areas and the biggest forms on the model, like on the top of the arm and everything like that. So here I added some gradients to the car, so it becomes darker towards the bottom, and some first pass on the highlights, as you can see here, and here on this area there is just a really rough first pass on how it would look with some highlights. I kinda try and get in some highlights for placeholder highlights for the metals sometimes to see where it will go and how it will look in the end, and if it falls apart when I go around the model. So I want to place highlights on parts where it makes sense, like on this area. This would most of the time make sense to have highlight and form to them. On the jumpsuit, like just really roughly drawing in some of the details and line work for the seams and stuff like that. And as you can see, it's like just really messy and blurry here. The texture is just not really paying too much attention to detail here, just placing everything loosely on the texture and see how it works, and you know, just keeping it super simple, super quick for as long as I can. Yep, also some minor things on the skull. Yep. And here on the face, and I believe on, yeah, I just used, on this stage I used a color dodge layer in 3D Code and added some extra lighting for different areas of the texture. As you can see here on the bumper, it becomes lit from a bit more intensely. Also, it's more visible here on the Pip-Boy. There is this light source here, and you know, I just added it so there is a hot spot on this item, so it's more interesting to look at. Also with the flask, it's really visible that I have a hot spot here, which makes it like I focus the detailing here and the highlights here more, so it makes it more interesting that way. Also the dagger has some hot spots to it, and the pistol, of course, the end of it is the brightest part. And also in this stage, as you can see, it's pretty blurry, but after that I use a medium-sized brush and, you know, kind of dot work all over the thing, and by using a smaller brush, all kinds of accidents and all kinds of weird patterns will occur, and then I can later use those patterns and accidents to emphasize them and make them more interesting. Yep, and push the detailing a bit more. Yep. Here, not sure. Yeah, just some minor changes, especially on the Pip-Boy, as you can see. Like started giving it a bit more highlights and more definition of detail and line work, like roughly doing some line work on what detail I want to put in there, and then adding highlights to emphasize those bevels and stuff like that on the texture. And yeah, on the face, basically what happened is started pushing the values a bit more, like, and this part is also, I think, received like some minor lighting coming from here, from the top. And when I say received lighting, I mean I used a big brush on a color dodge layer, like a soft brush, and just softly going over it. yeah, and added the eyes basically. And yeah, first pass of highlights, and as you can see, the nose is a bit red, and these parts are desaturated. So just basically giving it some skin tone and pushing the shadows beneath the eyebrows and in the eye sockets a bit more. And around this time I think we stopped the texturing recording, I believe. Not sure exactly, but yep, let's move on. Here I decided to separate the values a bit more. Like here, as you can see, there's a clear line or at where the bright value starts and where the midtones are, where the darker tones are. And this is exactly why I didn't really record this part of the texturing, because it was just too experimental. I wasn't sure where I want to take this whole thing, the texture and the style of the whole thing. So I just wanted to record the parts that I, usually do the same way, and then explain some of the experiments I did. So here I wanted to see how it would look if I separate the different values a bit more and giving them a harder edge. And as you can see here, I started to work on the bumper a bit more. There is like a second pass of detailing, and that is basically just emphasizing those, let me zoom in here, emphasizing those brush strokes I already talked about and giving them a bit more form. And also I figured that there were some cool scratch marks on the concept that looked kinda nice. I wanted to apply that to the texture also. So this is the first pass of detailing on the bumper. And each time I start texturing, I always start to love some of the areas a bit more and a bit more. And this bumper was something that, I kind of started liking a bit more. And because of that, it became the most detailed part of the whole thing after a while. And then I need to remind myself to go over and give some love to areas that I neglected. So yep, that's something to look out for always. Like some areas just grabs my attention, and I just stick with them without caring too much for the other areas. So anyway, yeah, this time I realized this and started giving some love to this part of the hood and to the lamps also, and added this first pass of texture of detailing to the skin, and added those brushstroke details and emphasized them a bit more, as I did like here or on the bumper. And yeah, this is what happened with this one, I think. Also, as you can see in this area here, there is a clear line on the jacket, but it's one tone here, so it's pretty boring for me. So I added some darker spots and darker deep shadows for the whole thing, like on the boots also, and the eyes, just giving it a bit more deep shadows. Yep, here just pushing the details even further, giving even more details, like deeper cuts to this area on the flask here, and also made the whole body of the car a bit darker, because I think it looks cooler this way, and also it emphasizes the difference between the chrome and the body of the car, so it makes it more interesting visually, I believe. Yep, moved up the cheekbone a little bit, the whole thing, whole thing a little bit, and exaggerated the eyebrows Yep, this is what happened here. So here I already started giving a bit more detail to this area using projection in 3D Code. So I have another video on this channel, I will link it somewhere so you can check it out, how I use projections. But basically just I went over the whole thing, the whole car and character, and projected each area out into Photoshop and went over it with a brush and detailed it up a little bit more. So let's zoom in here to see it more clearly. It's kinda blurry here and kinda uninteresting, but you know, it becomes super sharp or a bit more sharp than before, and I think it's more interesting that those little details and color variations coming in makes it much more interesting. Yep, some color adjustments to the Pip-Boy, and I realized some missing parts on the texture. And here, as you can see on the character, I went over the whole thing and added some, you know, smaller variations, color variations, and smaller brush strokes, and defined the hand a bit more. And on the skull, like the skull here, I think here or somewhere, yeah, around this part I detailed the skull up a bit more. But yeah, as you can see, just went over the whole thing with the projection thing and detailed it up a bit more. On the face you can see it more clearly, that just really small brush strokes and color variations all over the thing, and I think it, you know, looks a bit more sharp, crisp, more varied, and just generally more interesting. So these are the parts that were not really recorded during the texturing process, but I hope I explained it well for you guys, so you can understand what I was doing here. Oh, and also the Pip-Boy became more in tune with how it looks in Fallout 2. So yeah, these are the parts that were not recorded. And I will include the high-res process pictures into the Gumroad thing, which you can download. The links will be in the description, and definitely make sure to check the music video I made with this one, because I had fun doing it. It would be a shame if nobody saw that. And yeah, there is one more or two more parts to this video series, and I hope you guys will join me there.